Today on The State of Us, farmland versus solar. Who should win? Could they both win? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today we're looking at the solar industry and the farming industry. And at first glance, you may not necessarily know what these two have in common unless you live in an area like Lance and I do, where recently, for several months, the scuttlebutt had been about whether or not to allow farmland to be converted into large solar production facilities. Now, I think part of what we want to do is lay out the validity of both sides of this argument, because there are good arguments on both sides. And then the question becomes, so how do we move forward? And is there a possibility of moving forward with both? Obviously, spoiler, the answer is yes, there may be options where that's possible. And we're going to talk about what universities, farming and agriculture universities across the U.S. have been researching, what they're coming up with, and how that might work. So we got a lot to discuss today, Lance.
Is solar a knobby hobby? Knobby, our word. Yes, it's an adjective. And it means cleverly stylish, chic, or smart. So is solar a knobby industry, or is it something that is passing that by? And that's what I see. As an older generation here, it's like, well, that was really a cool thing when they talked about solar and solar power and this and that. But then you start to see more and more things pop up, and we're doing more and more things. Has it passed the idea of being stylish to, is it going to become a way of life sooner than a lot of us had anticipated? Knobby comes from the noun knob, which is used in British English to mean one in a superior position in life. Lately, it has been extended to describe places frequented by people such as that, but as well as their genteel customs. So is solar just for the genteel, or is it for the masses? I think that's kind of the question today.
Correct. I mean, right now, all renewable forms of energy total as of November of 2022, so this is data from 2021, most recent available, made up 19.8% of total energy generation for the United States. So, a fifth of our energy is produced by renewables. But keep in mind, that's all forms of renewables together. So that's wind, hydropower, solar, and biomass, along with geothermal, all combined. When you break it down by type, solar accounted for 2.8% in 2021 of total power generation for the United States.
Very knobby in the power industry.
Yes.
Very chic, very quaint. But I think I really do think we're going to see it grow quickly.
Well, and
I think there's going to be people that are fighting it tooth and nail for a variety of reasons, but I think it's going to happen anyway, because it makes sense. And here's the other thing. In one of these, not only does the federal government want it to, but you can usually get people's attention when you mention China. And China is doing everything it can to stop us from being able to produce solar panels and solar objects ourselves. I wonder why. Okay, you start talking about world power. Why is China concerned that we want to build our own solar panels, our own solar batteries, all of those things? Oh, because that might be the direction the world goes, and power over such world will be determined by who can control solar building?
So one of the items to discuss is this idea of which one should quote unquote win, right? I mean, the solar industry continues to grow. It's growing rapidly. Yes, it's a small component of total energy generation, but it's also a relatively new component. And when you look at the increase year over year, it's growing rapidly. The other question is obviously the international concern over if China is trying to prevent us from doing this, we should be concerned then about what is our ability to produce our own components. So there's this whole side of it, right? And obviously if if you're concerned and care about the climate, which we see more and more people obviously are, then solar energy is one of those items that you're probably thinking of and saying, hey, we need more of this, right? The thing that's happened now is there's this intersection between, well, where do we put the solar, right?
Well, and let's face it, we're all big proponents here at the State of Us for farmers because they produce the food that we live on. So the farmers do have good questions. I'm a farmer. I'm not against solar, but do you really want to put solar on land that produces food for the masses? Because then how do we come up with enough food for the world population to eat, which continues to grow?
Farmland's attractive because a lot of it is relatively flat, not all of it. I mean, obviously there's lots of rolling hills and stuff, but generally speaking, it's unobstructed too, which is a big thing for solar, right? If it's shaded, that doesn't do much good in terms of solar generation. So farmland looks like, hey, this is vacant, right? I mean, readily convertible land to put solar panels on. However, the flip side of that, right, is that farmland in the United States has contracted nearly 25% since the 1950s, according to data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's selling for record prices. All while in 1950, mind you, there were 2.5 billion people in the world. There are now more than 8 billion people. Farmland has contracted by a quarter, and we not only have more people, but we have more people starving. So we have less land to produce the food to feed the people, and we have more people, right? So, I mean, just from a very generic, breakdown, taking farmland for anything, power generation, housing, that's a problem. We could make more room by converting land that's not farmland to farmland by deforesting. Well, that poses a whole problem on its own, which we've started to talk about too, of how much hotter do you want the world to get? Because the more trees you take away, the less shaded the ground is, the more vegetation you kill off, the hotter, drier everything starts to become. You get into those desert things.
But if you don't find these alternative fuel sources and you continue to build, to use the carbon fuels, the land that is now good for farming will no longer be good for farming. So there's a counter thing to this as well. You can't say, well, you don't touch the farmland because we need all the farmland we can to grow all the crops that we can because the world is going hungry. But if we don't stop global warming, the land that is now farmland may be a mood issue because it'll be gone. It'll be too hot. It'll be too arid, and we'll be putting solar panels on it. But by that point, it might be too late.
And here's where the, paradox comes in for people is one really isn't quote unquote more important than the other. We have to increase solar generation. We also have to preserve and probably expand farming capabilities to better feed the growing population of the world. And yes, we've improved yields. I mean, we did a big conversation about that, almost an entire episode on talking about, one of the things that has changed is it's not just a matter of land. It's also what's the yield per acre, which is improved quite a bit, obviously, with lots of research going into how do we maximize what we can get off of a piece of land. But that question still brings up, or I think the question that still comes up then is there a way to make farmland even more productive, right? And I don't mean just by growing food, but could it produce solar and grow food and feed livestock? Right? I mean, there's different possibilities here, and it may not have to be a one or the other. And in fact, that's exactly what is being researched right now. The researchers say this concept, which is known as agrivoltaics, being able to grow crops on the same land where solar panels are in use, not only frees up limited farmland for multiple simultaneous uses, but also contributes to the emission reductions in the U.S. targeted in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Which is right up our alley. That's what we're always looking for, right? It's not black or white. It's not A or B, but how can we merge two different things and make it work effectively in both areas.
And agrivoltaics currently accounts for just a sliver of the world's total solar energy capacity at roughly 2.9 gigawatts at the end of 2020. But that capacity is expected to grow to more than 10 gigawatts by 2030, or the equivalent of more than 3,000 wind turbines, according to the U.S. Department of Energy. That's just over 1,000 gigawatts of solar capacity has been installed. And so obviously it's a very small measure, but you have universities that are doing research into this, like Purdue, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we optimize this? Because, how does this work? Well, we build these stands, right? And we elevate the solar panels up above the crops, and we spread them out enough that the crops can still get sun while the panels can still collect sun as well. Sounds great, except if you're like in the Midwest where we are, and you start thinking about, I'm not sure how practical is that for corn and soybeans? Because
Right.
like I have to drive a combine. You know what I mean? If this is something where like, take avocados, for example, or grapes or raspberries or, lower lying.
Things that grow closer to the ground.
Yes, of which you could elevate above and generally aren't harvested with machines that are nearly as massive, right? This starts to sound like, well, this could maybe make sense. But what about these other crops? I mean, is there really a possibility of that? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Agrivoltaics. Never heard that word until today, but I'm glad we heard it. It's the concept of putting farmland to use to both grow crops or produce livestock and simultaneously generate solar power. One of the ideal cases for this is fruits, vegetables, and herbs, because one of the increasing issues is as temperatures rise, right? Some of the climate, Lance had mentioned arid, as certain things become more arid and temperatures rise, the ground dries out in some areas, making it harder to grow certain crops because they can't retain the moisture they need. So what do you do about that? Well, you can say, well, you reverse climate change. Well, okay, but what do you do about that right now?
It sounds a lot like back in the Dust Bowl in the 30s when we learned, crop rotation to hold the soil together. Or you go all the way back to the Native Americans teaching the first Europeans coming to the New World, the three sister farming, where you would grow three plants intermingled among each other to replenish the soil and take out just certain nutrients and hold it together for water. And the other thing I think that it's interesting here is that it's Purdue University leading some of this research. And if you're not familiar, Purdue is in the state of Indiana, which is one of the biggest agricultural states in the Midwest. So it's not like it's these ultra liberals on the coast who are looking for something, well, we're just going to ruin this Midwest farmland. It is a Midwestern university in the heart of the American farmland who is leading this revolution to try to find a way to make these two entities work together.
Human society has done a lot of selective breeding and genetic modifications to crops over the years to create certain crops that can thrive in a given environment, but
and produce higher yields, right?
Correct.
Which allows us to produce food on less land than we had 50, 60 years ago.
While corn and soybeans might be grown primarily in full sun right now, there's also questions about, could it actually be better and yield more if they got a little bit of shade throughout the day, and if that shade was selective and was rotated? So there's a lot of questions, and that's part of why universities like Purdue are doing this research, because on smaller scale farms, right, or even larger scale farms, but that are not harvesting row crops being primarily corn and soybeans, so all manner of vegetables, right, berries, certain kinds of fruit, things like that, is where an immediate application of this can make a lot of sense. In fact, there was a local farm that had to change regulations in 2017 to allow 3,200 solar panels to go in. The project was built in the summer of 2020 and began producing energy on November 1st of that year. The owner says he borrowed $2 million to help finance the project. This is a farmer, but the revenue stream from sales of electricity produced by the panel array has him planning to be debt-free in the next 15 years. He says, the farmer, quote, "The financial side of the array, it's paying more than hay ever did," referring to hay as in the crop. The other thing is hay is an example, not a row crop per se, but hay is an example of something that actually, depending on what you're growing, we have full sun mixes, but depending on how aggressive the sun is or how little moisture you get that year, too much can really be detrimental to the yield of the hay as well. And the other thing is moisture retention in the soil, right? We talk about a lot, and especially with row crops, is how quickly does that all dry out. So there's opportunities with shading to not necessarily just help the crops directly, but to retain more moisture in the soil and create what the article in Purdue University referred to as microclimates underneath the solar panels that are better regulated and protected from the harsh sun. Use the sun to collect the power, give enough of it to the crops, exactly what they need, retain more moisture in the ground. It sounds great.
They're just working on a small scale now, right? Though
Correct.
It's not like anything that can go out to farmers in the next 3 to 5 years, but they're finding some positivity here on a small scale basis.
And they're looking at how, because the big question is, yes, on the small scale, right? Great. It seems like we can do this. But if we're really going to make an impact, we have to be able to do it where we have row crops, right? Corn and soybeans primarily. We have to be able to deploy it there somehow. And that's what Purdue's focusing on. They have test deployments out that they're researching right now. They say that yields for its test crops are typically 8 to 10% below where they would be without the installations. But keeping in mind, they believe that they can completely eliminate that altogether. The only drop in yield would be from the actual post position that elevates this, because these can go up to, I think it's 16 feet right now into the air. So the goal is they're looking at, based on the orientation of fields and rows, how could we get these positioned and set in such a way where we're really not sacrificing hardly any crops, if any, to do this? And if we are sacrificing, can we improve the yields of the crops that get any benefit from the solar panels enough to offset that? And then if you can do that, right, you've truly achieved the golden ticket here in terms of you've created an additional revenue stream for farmers and you've not sacrificed an existing revenue stream.
And they can produce more crops because they'll actually get a higher yield because of scientifically.
If things work out the way that the way that Purdue believes they could.
Right. So what you really have to think about is that, okay, well, I've seen some of these solar panels, these solar fields, as I drive down the road. Oh, there's no way you can grow crops there. Okay, but that's what Purdue is saying. We're going to redesign the solar fields that will allow crops to be able to be grown. So, again, you have to look at it from all sides. No, the way solar is collected right now doesn't work well for farmers, but they're looking at new ways and better ways to collect the sun to turn it into energy, which would allow then farming to still take place. And I think that's, you have to have that visionary and say, well, yeah, the way it's done now is not going to work. By God, you can't keep doing it that way. Rah, rah. Exactly. That's what Purdue is saying. They're saying we're going to revamp the way we do one industry so it doesn't hurt the other industry. And I think that's a plus. The
industries can coexist as agrivoltaics.
That win-win, that synergy between the two allows us to get the best from both.
And the other thing is, because we've been talking a lot about crops, but what about the rest of agriculture? Because as we know, crops are not the only way that we feed people. I mean, we've done a lot of conversations on this show over the years about the meat industry, right? Chickens, cattle, pigs, and how those contribute to the global food supply system, but also how they contribute to climate change and what we do about that long term. And there's potentially a solution, or at least something that improves the equation by using solar panels here as well, right?
Yeah. How many of you ever got to play a shepherd in church during Christmas? You say a shepherd, I'm saying a shepherd. For your little kid, I remember my little brother, he got to be the bionic shepherd at the Christmas presentation at church, because he was of the age of, I don't know if you remember Lee Majors and the Bionic Man. He was the bionic shepherd. But shepherds, remember shepherds in the Bible? We've read about the life of a shepherd.
Okay, so sheep, is that what we're talking about?
They're coming back, right? Shepherds are making a comeback in Texas and Oklahoma. Really? And you say, really? Are people eating a lot more mutton now? Or are people wearing wool clothing? Is that what it is? Actually, no. Sheep are now the solar industry's lawnmowers of choice. Now think about that, right? You go past a solar field and you see it. It sits, very close to the ground. It's, it's kind of skewed up at an angle so it can collect the most of the sun's rays, but yet vegetation does grow underneath it. We've been talking about farmland, but now there's scrub grasses and scrub things, that plants that will grow underneath there. And it's like, those will continue to grow and start to block the ability of these.
So generally they spray. I mean, that's been the answer, is you spray chemicals and kill it.
Well, and you would hire a landscaping company, but they can't get their mowers in there. They're not high enough. And when they start to weed eat, they cut the lines, which, that kind of hurts things. A lot of potential problems. Right. And bigger animals like cows and horses can't get underneath the solar panels. Goats worked, except goats, as you know, will eat any plant, but they'll also eat wires. And so that was hurting. And so they started using sheep. And the article talks about this one man had a business, his own little business in concrete. And he bought some sheep, and now he employs 15 people, has over 2,000 sheep, and clears the land of 3 major solar power companies in Texas. And he's paid off, and he's just growing by leaps and bounds. And he's a shepherd because he, along with his team, moves the sheep from area to area based on where the clearing needs to be done. And not to also say then he can get the wool and the meat off of the sheep, but he's getting paid. He's making most of his money by taking his sheep out to pasture in the solar panel fields and eating the grasses that are growing there on the prairie so that they don't block the ability of the panels to collect sun. This one gentleman has spent $500,000 to start up his business to do this. So we're not talking about 50 sheep and it's a small scale. Here's a guy who took out loans up to $500,000, $500,000 to start his own sheep business to do this, to clear these solar panel fields in Texas and Oklahoma. So, I mean, it's starting to become big business to be a shepherd.
The shepherd industry is being revived.
It's growing
by solar panels.
But again, the jobs that are created in a new industry that you don't even think about, right?
Well,
it's like, okay, we planted the field
down the chain, right? Because it's not the company itself that generates the job, but because you have this, you now need to maintain this. So what else do you have?
It's on land that's not farmland, but it doesn't mean vegetation doesn't grow out in the prairie, but that vegetation can grow and block. So now how do you cut it down? Man, we built this great solar panel area and we don't have any way to clear it. Bring the sheep and the shepherds in and they will do the job.
So what else does this signal to us in terms of potential? Sheep, great, but how many of our listeners eat mutton on a weekly basis? I'm sure we have some, but I personally don't, and I don't think that Lance does either. Not
on a regular basis, but I do like it.
Right, I was going to say, not that I'm necessarily opposed to it.
If somebody prepares it well, I do like
the wool is definitely valuable. I mean, especially when we talk about renewable, clothing is a huge component that I think often gets overlooked. So having that renewable form of wool is absolutely beneficial. But Is it only sheep, or is there potential for other forms of livestock as well? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Part of what's exciting about the notion of the return of shepherds as, basically bringing in these flocks of sheep to, mow essentially the solar fields underneath the panels is it opens up these questions about combining what we've heard in agrivoltaics with the notion of livestock. Because, for example, in our county here, Champaign County, where Lance and I live, there's a lot of land that's used for livestock that is not used for anything other than livestock. In other words, like you think of cattle grazing on hills that are too steep to farm, or they may not technically be too steep, but like it's just not, it's more economical to deploy livestock here to graze it than it is to put crops here because of the cost that would be associated with doing that, and also potentially lower yields because it's on a hill, and just all the things that can go into that. So you look at land like that and say, well, it's just grass right now, or prairie. How could this be utilized not and get rid of the livestock, but coexist with it, much like we're talking about with the crops? And that, I think, is where this opens up the notion of elevated panels, figuring out best positioning to not only not lessen how strong your grass grows, right, for your cattle or other livestock to graze, but also maybe even make it grow better, because you get the right mix of sun and shade going, better moisture retention in the soil. You're also providing shade for the animals, which I don't know, not to get too into the weeds for folks, but one of the things that you have to be concerned about, like if you're grazing cattle and it gets really hot, is they often don't spend as long outside because they find shade in the middle of the day because they get overheated. This is a potential solve for some of that in terms of you keep them out in pasture longer. Ideally, they graze longer and grow faster because they're not having to go into the barn and thereby also make a mess that somebody has to clean up.
Right.
So these are ancillary things, but that's why I'd be all for Purdue, Ohio State University, some of these big agricultural universities getting some more funding to study this, because I really, just anecdotally, as somebody who raised cattle and lives in one of these counties, I see a ton of potential for it to help farmers generate more income while also serving to help the planet, which helps farmers long term, while also not taking away from the agriculture industry.
Because that's a problem for the farmers, is it's a tough way to make a living. So if you can find a way with solar panels or wind to where they can continue to farm, but make some money doing something else so that they can continue to farm. Because we've seen a lot of really rich farmland in the last 20 or 30 years around where we live being sold to developers of subdivisions, because the farmers or the kids who took over dad or grandpa's field don't want to farm anymore. And so they sell it to a real estate developer who puts 500 homes on it. And while that maybe is good for the economy on one hand, well, we're losing farmland that way. Okay. And yes, people have a place to live now, and towns grow and economies multiply, and that can be a good thing. But the motivation for selling maybe was because they couldn't make any money farming. But if they could continue to farm and make some money with renewable energy sources, then we keep more people in farming, which then, i.e., leads to more food for people to eat, which seems like the best of both worlds. And I'm sitting here not being a farmer or understanding solar panels. I'm not an expert at all. But wouldn't it, on this hilly land you were talking about, wouldn't it be conducive to put solar panels on top of the hill? Because that would be less likely for the trees and everything else that are growing on the land to block the sun's rays. Yet the animals could climb the hill in the late morning or early afternoon and stay behind it and get the shade, and then walk back down the hill in the cool of the evening and do more grazing before you brought them in. I mean, Isn't that kind of the pattern that would happen?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't need shepherds because the animals are smart enough to seek out the shade. So you wouldn't have to drive them up the hill. They would see that that's a
they're
shaded
going to go to where
area.
the food is.
Right. Okay. And also that shade provides grasses to be grown, possible food for them without needed to bring in food to them.
U.S. solar production may need to grow more than 20-fold, potentially occupying an aggregate area the size of West Virginia. So for perspective about how much bigger our solar industry ideally needs to get, that helps you kind of visualize the size of what we're talking about, which is why figuring deployments for this is important. The other thing is I have to mention this because I feel like it's been a while since we talked about solar, but it's so important of the applications for solar going in underutilized places, right? Does that mean farmland? It means agrivoltaics, right? Don't sacrifice the farmland in the name of solar. Figure out how to work them together. Likewise, there's tons of opportunity for deployment on rooftops, which is grossly underutilized across the United States. This is land that already has a building sitting on it, right? And generally speaking, the roof is pretty much wasted on most buildings. I mean, you have a roof up there, and that's usually about the extent. Like, I mean, how often you up on your roof?
It may have a cooling mechanism built into the air conditioning unit.
Correct.
Is built on the ceiling, but it's also getting direct hits from the sun, which makes it use more energy to operate.
To cool
because and so if you put, and tell me if I'm wrong, you could put some solar panels up there, give the air conditioning units some shade, which means they would operate much better,
more efficiently,
and be collecting energy to run said air conditioning units.
Especially if you're talking commercial buildings nowadays, the flat roof thing's obviously very common. Like you think of a lot of fast food restaurants, but
nobody's going up
see
there.
The top of the roof,
right?
So who cares what's up there and what it looks like? Why not use it to generate power? And you say, well, sure, use it to generate power. We also should be incentivizing that, and we should be improving the technology for roof installations because
and that's the other thing, right? You got to capture the energy.
Yeah.
I mean, where's it go? I mean, okay, I can put solar panels up, but there's more to it, right? We have to somehow connect it to a grid or to a power source that can collect it. And so there's a lot of the inner workings of this industry. It's not just putting up panels, but we have to work the grids so that they're more conducive to collecting this power. And so to your point, needs to be incentivized.
Correct.
So that people are willing to spend the money on the inside work of this.
And I want to see universities doing research, Lance, on a rethinking of the electric grid too, because it seems to me that, one of the challenges, right, all these power outages and stuff we hear about is that we rely, generally speaking, on centralized distribution of power, right? Now, grids have redundancies in them, which are designed ideally to avoid those outages. But obviously we know, especially in recent years, that's not always how that works. It's not at all uncommon for portions of a grid to go down, even with redundancies in them. Now, this doesn't totally eliminate it, but the more rooftop installations you have, and the more smaller forms of power generation, if the grid is designed correctly, you could be talking about, it's kind of the same notion of cities that have installed smart water valves so that when a leak occurs, because this is a thing that our city actually dealt with for a long time of, you don't immediately know where the leak is. And so you end up shutting off whole quadrants of the city and then finding the leak and fixing it. And people go without water, potentially for a day or two because you have to find the thing and then you have to repair it. And really, it may have been a stretch of pipe where you only had to cut off 2 or 3 people from water, but because of the way the system's set up, you had to cut off all these people. And it's usually the same thing with a grid. It's usually not a catastrophic failure of the grid, like somebody ran into a telephone pole, it collapses, and now, these folks are without power because of this problem. The interesting thing is that if this system is designed correctly with the right research, you ought to be able to decentralize some of that. And instead of taking entire neighborhoods offline, it's 2 or 3 people that go offline because everybody else is generating power.
Well, there have been columnists in the last decade or so that have written about terrorism of different kinds,
Correct.
Attacking our power grid. And if you decentralize it,
it makes it safer.
Right. All of a sudden, one bomb or one explosion or one attack
can't wipe it out.
Doesn't wipe out the whole East Coast or West Coast of the United States.
Yeah, I was disappointed. Our county obviously recently moved, for example, to regulate solar installations on farmland. Not disappointed because I don't want to see farmland converted to solar, but two main reasons is, one, figure out how to do both, right? And I think the good news is...
Just don't say no,
right.
Carte blanche.
And they're saying no because of 2 big concerns: farmland, right, loss, and also tax loss. People forget about that component, but often these solar installations and the companies that put them in come with this, well, we want X tax abatement, which sounds great at first, but then when you figure that this is land that used to produce and pay tax and now does not have to pay tax for a certain amount of time, let's figure out how to selectively do it. And let's figure out how to, just like with building code, let's try to avoid ever saying just, no, we're not ever going to do this. If we're going to do it, here's how we're going to do it responsibly. Also avoid too much government overreach, because interestingly, free market conservatives and libertarians have teamed up with the solar industry on pushing back on regulation like this, saying, wait a minute, this violates a property owner's rights to determine how to use their land. We may not want the farmland to be converted to this, but shouldn't they have the right to determine how their land's going to be used if it's not, degrading the overall neighborhood, or the overall area? And again, this is one of those ways where you can kind of solve that by saying, here's a good free market solution that helps everybody make more money and accomplishes both sides' goals.
Again, and that's what we're all about here, right?
It's not very often that happens where it actually can be truly, I think, a win for everybody.
When you always ask me at the end of the show, which we've reached that time.
Yes.
Why did we talk about this?
Why did we?
Well, I think you just said it, right? We're looking to solve problems.
Compromise.
Which is the whole point of this show and the company we work for, True Chat. We have a mission to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations on today's issues. And hopefully today you found this to where we're not against farmers and we're not against solar energy. We're looking for a way that can both coexist, because we feel very strongly that both need to be supported. And that's why we talk about this stuff. And hopefully you enjoyed today's show. You share it with your family and friends. And when they're asking, well, how can we listen to this show? Because, not that we don't trust you and we like the fact that you're telling us about it, but we'd like to listen to it ourselves. Tell them as a podcast. They can find us on Stitcher, Apple Podcast, you name it, Spotify, all those places. If they know how to get to a podcast, they can find us.
They can find us. We release new episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays of the podcast. You can also hear those same episodes on the weekend on AM and FM talk radio stations across the country. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.